I said this at press conference at Sundance, and my publicist was like, "Don't say that." But I was like, I don't want to make a film like Frankie and Johnny and the Claire de Lune and have Michelle Pfeiffer play a working class waitress, because I'm like, come on, she don't look
Right.
like no waitress I've ever seen. And so I'm interested in working with theater actors, character actors, people who actually look like the roles instead of I'm slumming it and playing a trash man in Boston. Give me awards. I'm not interested in that.
Good day, filmmaker Kyle Henry of your latest film, Time Passages. Kyle, how are you on this fine morning?
I'm wonderful. It's a frosty morning in Boston. We're at the second
Ooh,
city of our nationwide tour. So glad to be here with you.
awesome. So, Time Passages is releasing throughout the United States. I see that you have a screening coming up in Chicago. Should people look on the website to see if it's
Yeah,
screening near
please do.
them?
Yeah, timepassagesfilm.com or at any of the social media at Time Passages Film. You can see where we're up next. Yeah, Chicago's next. After that, we're playing for a week in LA at the Lemley Glendale. But I'll just be all over the place.
That's exciting. It's such a unique film. It's almost like you are a professor at Northwestern University. I'm almost say that it's almost a graduate level documentary because, and I want to explore this
Yeah,
with you maybe a little bit later, but like this idea that somehow you are able to break the rules of documentary because you know the rules of documentary, which I
yeah,
imagine is part of it. But Kyle, how did you get started in filmmaking? Was it something, and you touch upon it a little bit in this
yeah.
film, but was it something you knew early on, or was it something that you just saw the talent come on gradually and then you're like, got to go for it?
Well, I grew up in League City, Texas, which is a bedroom community of NASA. And I was surrounded by science. And I actually thought I was going to be a biology major. That's what I got into Rice University as. But I found myself in the cinema constantly. And I stayed up always and was watching The Late Show on TV. And I was in the Super 8 film club in high school. The things were always there. I just had to be brave enough to not take the route that I felt like as a middle class kid. I was like, oh my gosh, I got to make money. I got to be a biologist. And at a certain point, I was like, I don't care about biology. I care about film. So that was my route to filmmaking, was this sort of obsession with film. And luckily, too, I worked at the College Repertory Cinema as a ticket taker and then a projectionist. And I just got to
Interesting.
see everything over the course of 4 years.
And so your debut feature Room premiered at Sundance Frontier, Cannes Fortnight,
Yep.
nominated for Spirit Awards, the John Cassavetes Award, which I would say, and maybe you would agree with me here, is it's probably the most genuine Spirit Award that's out there because it's celebrating truly independent film.
Yeah.
You had all these awards for your debut feature. Was that like, what do you attribute that to? Do you attribute that to just your study of the medium of you knew what you were doing on your first feature? Was some of it just luck as part of it? Like how when you started out and you got those plaudits at your very first film, what would
Yeah.
you attribute that to?
Well, one, making a lot of bad films before. I tell my students, get those out of the way. And
Right.
like, I made also a couple of documentaries when I was in grad school that were feature length that I toured with. And I think my continued interest in filmmaking is a continued interest in the world. And I think if you're
Interesting.
interested in the world and not just in filmmaking, you have a kind of passion to express something about what you're seeing and what is happening. With Room, it was right after 9/11. Me and my future husband were living in New York. Like I saw the towers fall. And then we were all living through that very crazy war on terror time. And I thought we psychically were being tortured as much in some ways as how the world was being made to pay in retribution for what
Right.
happened to 9/11. And I wanted to tell a story that was like a psychic thriller, but give the central story to a normal looking working class woman in Houston who worked at a bingo hall, like the kind of bingo halls that my father delivered supplies to. So the interest in making work that challenges form was always there, because I think our minds work better when we're presented with something new. but I've always wanted to tell stories that also, like those films in the 70s, which are can be radically formal. You watch a
Right.
film like Midnight Cowboy, and it's still shocking the kind of things that Schlesinger is doing, but they're telling stories about regular people under extraordinary circumstances. And I I said this at press conference at Sundance, and my publicist was like, "Don't say that." But I was like, I don't want to make a film like Frankie and Johnny and the Claire de Lune and have Michelle Pfeiffer play a working class waitress, because I'm like, come on, she don't look
Right.
like no waitress I've ever seen. And so I'm interested in working with theater actors, character actors, people who actually look like the roles instead of I'm slumming it and playing a trash man in Boston. Give me awards. That's I'm not interested in that.
That's funny, Cal. So I think part of it is in what you're saying is you engage with the world. Like you were
Yes.
out there, you were seeing things that were occurring around you, and you
Yeah.
decided to document them. Do you find that challenging with students nowadays? Can you imagine like the student nowadays spends a lot of time online, spends a lot of
Yeah.
time making things for social media? Is that a big thing that comes up with you telling your students, hey, get out there in the world. You can't just be making documentaries, great documentaries by being on your phone 12 hours a day.
I don't think you can ever make your own work by modeling it on what has been done in the past, because
Mm,
that's been done.
right,
I feel sometimes the students I try to push are the ones who are like, I want to make a film just like that Netflix series. And I'm like, that Netflix series was done. They did it at a lot bigger budget. And you
right,
trying to do like a poor man's version of it is not maybe what you have to express in the world. Start
right.
with something that you and your friends can do that is meaningful for you. I also try to get my students to say, like, you've got stories within you. Don't think that your family's stories or the life experience that you've had, that you don't have something really authentic there that other people are going to be interested in. And then the genre stuff will come. But in terms of documentary, I go back and forth between documentary and fiction film, and I am always interested in story. I think if you've got a documentary, even one that's formally innovative, that has a story hook to it, people are going to care. So this film has a lot of stuff that it's talking about, but the story is the last 5 months of trying to struggle to stay connected with my mom, who was in a nursing home during the pandemic, and the high stakes drama of what's going to happen to this family.
Right. Wow. That takes it in an interesting direction because I was expecting you to say, yeah, I try to emphasize to my students the way that I did it. But ultimately, that you can't put that on them, right? Like you can't
Mm-mm.
say to them, here's how I was successful. Here's how you will be successful. Because it's a different time, a different era. And almost like you are asking them to do it the way that you did it, and that ultimately may not be successful in their age. So that's a really interesting way to put it, and a high level way to put it. And I think that is a great segue to the film Time Passages, which I mentioned is like graduate level filmmaking, Kyle,
Yeah.
because like you think about a documentary and what documentary schools typically teach, and it's not what you created. So can you talk a little bit about what your first of all, can you did a little bit describe the
Yeah.
film, but give sort of the log line for it, and then talk about how you came upon the different ways in which you engaged on the documentary because psychedelic in some cases. There's like an interview. I hope I'm not spoiling anything here, where you're like interviewing in a very unique way, to put it mildly. So, can you tell people what they should expect to see, and then
Yeah.
what your decision making process on making the film the way it is made?
Imagine you could go back in time with your parents through your family archive and try to understand them through the evidence that remains, but also through a journey through your mind. And that, I think, is what the film is about.
Brilliant.
It's struggling to put all the pieces in place, not like a scrapbook
Right.
per se, where it looks all pretty for some other person to look at and go, "Ooh, what wonderful display." But how can you make sense of all the contradictory pieces of your mother or father or parent? And how can you also let go? The whole process of life seems to be like attachment,
Right.
and then you have to let go. You're going to be raising a kid here, and you're going to have to create a safe container, but at a certain point it's venture forth. You must
Do
leave the
your own thing.
home, do
Yeah.
your own thing. And I like to think of the film as like a narrative, but also a wagon wheel where there's different spokes, and we can take side journeys to understand ourselves, my mother and myself, more completely by understanding us in context of being Americans in the 20th century.
Wow. Do you think this film could have been made 20 years ago? Like, you think about the evolution of documentary films, and
Mhm.
you're seeing sort of these hybrid documentaries made. I don't know if I would call this a hybrid documentary, but it's close to
Sure.
that
Yeah.
line. Yeah. Do you think, like, just the evolution of docs trying to make them more engaging with the audience, do you think that has changed in the last 20 years, and that this is a product of that, that it couldn't be released in the way it is, say, in 2005?
I mean, 2005, maybe no, because the films were really focused on ripped from the headlines, like advocacy work.
Right.
But you still had films like not Roger and Me, but that were performative, or
Right.
because Michael Moore's playing a character as much as he is playing himself. I think
True.
too, Europeans have always been more open to experimentation, like the films of Agnes Varda or Alain Resnais, or even Louis Malle, who came here to the United States and eventually immigrated, who made documentaries about Tour de France, or which is a very kind of straightforward competition doc. But then he would make things like My Dinner with Andre, which is like a 2 hour conversation kind of between two people at a restaurant that's riveting. That's a is it, it's and is it a documentary? It's these two theater artists probably talking about things that they normally talk about, but it's also a great story. So I want to work with the material that I have. I didn't grow up in LA and New York. I don't have a ton of money, but I can creatively engage with the world around me. And that is a possibility now, especially with the tools that we have, the
Right.
distribution possibilities that we have. I think the biggest challenge is reaching an audience.
Right.
I think if you were Rick Linklater or Tarantino or Steven Soderbergh in the early 90s, and you hit it big, there was a whole pipeline and a limited industry, right? Like it was just going to
Right.
come to a movie theater near you, mallplex. You didn't have 200 channels and streaming services. Like, how do we find anything now? I think that's
Yeah,
the big
no, exactly.
challenge.
What an answer. So, one of the things that amazed me, there's so many things that amazed me about the film, was that, but one of them that stood out is how long it must have taken for you to make this. There were
Yeah.
some footages like pre-COVID. Even before that, you're pulling footage from your parents doing an interview that had to have been maybe 20 years ago,
Yes.
15 years ago. So how long has this project been gestating? And then if you could go back and tell yourself something at the beginning of the project, would it be, label things better, like organize footage better, something
Yeah.
like that? If somebody's embarking on this type of project, what would you tell Kyle Henry at the start of it? Man, do this and it'll save yourself a lot of time later on.
I maybe would have told myself, shut up and listen more. Like, I think this was way more of an essay film at the beginning where I had lots of things to say. And I think working with editors is a really great gift because you can ask other people, what do you see in the material?
Interesting.
And I receded so that my mother's voice could become more part of this project. And those interviews that are in the film from 20 years ago are when I saw that my mother's mind was going, and I was like, oh my goodness, if I just don't sit the two of them down and have them tell me their stories now,
Right.
I don't know when it's ever going to happen. And I did it on a really crappy one chip camera with bad sound, like with a microphone across the room. And this is something that's maybe now is possible that was never possible, was the AI tools that were possible in Pro Tools to
Yeah.
make my mother's voice, which was completely off mic in a terrible microphone. I was freaked out in the sound mix studio because she felt like she was right there. And now, sadly, I can't tell my students, you got to get the sound right in the field or it's not
Right.
usable. Because it's like, oh my God, we are resuscitating the dead now. It's like a seance or something. I would have also told myself to keep focused on the story. I have a tendency to be interested in lots of things,
Right.
but my editors really help me. We can veer away for a little bit, but what is the story? What is the story? What is the story? You only have 90 minutes or 2 hours. You can't do everything. Keep it simple, stupid. Try. I think the film reflects the tension between the wonderfully heroic and valiant efforts of my editors to keep it simple with my interests of everything that's going on around me. And we synthesize something into this really unique, weird form.
Fantastic. So it's a great segue to the state of film school. So
Yeah.
it's really great. I think your students benefit from the fact that you're not only talking like back in my day type of thing, and then not doing anything, but you're actively like engaging in the medium. It must feel very satisfying. I read the Roger Ebert film, a review of the film from a couple days ago, and it was
Yeah,
great, which must feel good for yourself. I was thinking like, how must it feel like for his students if he comes in and the reviews of the film are like, this guy shouldn't be making films. You shouldn't listen to
yeah,
this. Wait a second. Why am I in class? But the reviews were great. I'm thrilled to see that. So, what's the state of film school right now? Like, I've heard some people speculate because people have phones and are making
yeah,
things that they're able to create things and that's better. But then I heard another argument that, hey, that's keeping people away from the basics. What
yeah.
would you tell somebody who doesn't interact with film students a lot? What the state of our medium is going forward?
I think film students are great to find community.
Okay.
Filmmaking is a collaborative art form. And if you think you can do it all on your own and work on your own, I quickly was disabused of that when I was in Houston as an undergrad, where I was like, this is not a media making town. There's not a lot of people here. I found the ones I could work with, which was great, but it was like, I've got to move where there's younger people or people my age, and I've got to work in collaboration with people. So one, it helps you find community at a time when you don't even know how to make community. It's like suddenly you're in a class with people. I also tell my students too, these are the people that you might be working with for the rest of your life. So don't be mean and don't be disrespectful and don't think this isn't real. This is real. It's real right
Right.
now. Treat it at real. So film school also, at least at Northwestern, we're all active filmmakers. And I think that's the
That's awesome.
value of going to like the Northwestern or a University of Texas Austin or UCLA, NYU, wherever they want us to be out in the field working. They give us the kind of flexibility to do that because they know I've been teaching producing classes now for the last 14 years. And my
That's awesome.
God, the industry is so changed over those
Right.
14 years. I can't put it forward to them, the Christine Vachon book, and say, this is how it's done, without a lot of caveats and a lot of other articles to say, like, I think things are radically different than when Christine Vachon was founded Killer Films in like the 90s.
Wow. Wow. So I'm excited to see what the release of Time Passages looks like over the next few weeks
Yeah.
and also hear what's next for you. So have you started another project? Like if you could scope out the next few weeks and months for your career, what does that look like, Kyle?
I go back and forth between fiction and documentary, and I think the next
Okay.
project will be fiction again. Me and my
Awesome.
husband, who's a screenwriter and playwright, wrote a script in the late 90s. Get this pitch about a group of activists who own an organic farm where a terrorist action takes place on a oil rig off the coast of Texas, and there's a crackdown on immigrants, and a
Ooh.
mass roundup starts occurring. I'm like, okay, why were we prescient? Like, how did we write this script in the mid aughts? And I'm reviving that script and trying to take it out to places. And we have another project called Last Autumn. It's a three-hander set on an island in Michigan where some kind of unexplainable event occurs which knocks out all the electricity and separates three radically different people from the coast. And they have to decide, do they venture off this island when they see fires occurring in the
Right.
horizon, or do they stay? And I hope it'll be a film about how radically different people collaborate with each other, because I think we need those kind of stories right now instead
Completely.
of Squid Games 5, where it's you gotta kill everybody to survive. And if we keep going down those story routes, it's like we're all gonna be dead. We need stories that show how really different people can come together for survival.
And Kyle, we're only probably a couple years away from Squid Games in reality, so we
Ugh,
don't we
God,
need like
no.
fictional people working together. That's the realm of fiction, Kyle. Squid Game is more reality.
I not all manifest, like I don't live in LA, but I do think like another world is possible. And
Yeah,
we always have to keep that in mind. And I think those who like to terrorize our minds
right.
sometimes like to say, this is the only way, there's no other possibility. There's this phrase that Margaret Thatcher used to use, Tina. there is no alternative. And it's like, that's just telling you to shut up. That's
Right.
what that's
No,
about.
completely.
Yeah.
So that's being a beacon for hope, and I really appreciate that. So, do you feel like filmmakers now have to have that muscle of both documentary and narrative? Like, you can't just be like, "I'm a narrative filmmaker" at this point. You almost have to go do both what interests you and then what can actually be produced and distributed.
I think you need to think by any means necessary. If you want to be
Yeah,
a visual storyteller, what you think you're gonna do is not the thing maybe you're gonna do. And how
right.
can you just keep I like stories. I'm gonna keep telling stories. The formats might change. People for a while were like using TikTok to try to tell stories. Now they're just selling like face cream. But for a while there, it was really interesting, right? Like it was like, oh, how do I make a short film in this weird little format? And I think that's I think that's helpful to just keep scanning the horizon as long as you live and try to think how you can tell your story in whatever form is possible for you.
Love it. Kyle's the Indie Film Podcast. Love hyping other people's projects. You
Yeah.
said community matters so much to me as well. Is there a film or filmmaker that you watch all the time that you wish more people knew about?
I'm staying right now with two filmmakers whose work I wish more people knew about, which is Julia Halpern and Jason Cortland. They have a new feature film called Crooked Finger that's out and is probably going to be coming to a festival near you. I also think that I would look for whatever is the repertory film program near you. It could be at a museum, a college campus. Go see the films that are playing there, the nonprofit spaces. I think you're going to be exposed to things that you didn't even know you could like, and just go. Sometimes I don't even read the any reviews for the film. I just read
Go.
the blog line. I'm like, that kind of sounds interesting. And I show up, and sometimes I'm just radically surprised.
That's a great way to look at things. I think your students are blessed to have you. Kyle Henry, your newest film is Time Passages, showcasing throughout theaters throughout the country. Hopefully, people can go to the website and maybe see you there at their screening near them. It's a great film. Check it out. I would say graduate level documentary. It's just not what you expect. And you come out of there both crying, laughing, fantastic feeling, great work. And thank you for joining me today on the podcast.
It was wonderful being here, and we're on all the social medias at Time Passages Film.